All right, welcome back. This is chapter 15, part 4. Oftentimes, there's a lot of instability within nations and states because the difference between the political action and the cultural area, right? There can often be what they call an incongruence between a nation and a state. So, in the Middle East, we have several nations, cultural groups of people that don't have a state. So, a good example is Kurdistan. There is actually no country, no state of Kurdistan. There is the state of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Armenia, Syria, but people who are culturally Kurdish, right? They speak a different language, they have a different culture. You can see they kind of overlap all these areas. And there's a lot of unrest. Some of these areas, the majority of people are Kurdish. In Turkey, right, the eastern half of Turkey, a large portion of the country is actually predominantly Kurdish, and they feel that they are a minority and not being treated right. There's a lot of unrest. In fact, in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been basically fighting, armed insurrections between these two groups. You can have a state that has more than one nation. So this is the state of Belgium. It's a country in Europe, but basically Belgium, either you're Flemish or you're Walloon. Okay, and what that means is the people who are Belgian, that's the nation. I'm sorry, that's the state. See, even I do it. That's the state they live in. But if you're Flemish, you live in this area called Flanders. The language you speak is much closer to German. If you live in the southern half of the country, you speak a language which is much closer to French. And it's roughly this line. And both groups, there is not one dominant group. I believe it's basically 45%, 45%, and a few others. So there's a lot of tension. And they have issues, good and bad, with that. But a lot of times there's a discussion about the country splitting in two. So with these minority groups or difference of nations within one state, how successful they are, how unsuccessful they are, depends in large part on the idea of tolerance. How tolerant are they of each other? Are there protections built into it? Some countries that have the situation have laws that say that only so many people from this group can be in Congress, or that the presidency must rotate between someone who's Flemish and somebody who's Walloon every year. They kind of build that in, or they try to build intolerance, or they write laws that don't recognize this. Um, in Rwanda in the 1990s, there was a genocide between these two groups. The majority group in Rwanda was actually almost completely eliminated. Almost 1 million people were killed by the minority group during the Civil War. And after that war was done, the country made a rule that no one could use their tribal ethnicity, their cultural designation for anything legal. In other words, we don't recognize the difference. We know that culturally there's something, but we don't recognize it legally. So this territory of the state, where the state is located, right? They have national territory and they have a government or a state, and those are the forces that are in power. A new term that we've heard quite often in our country lately is this idea of the deep state, entrenched power. So every 4 years we have a presidential election. So conceivably we have a new president every year, although he may win re-election, so maybe every 8 years. But think about this: when Donald Trump became president, he was of a different party than the previous government of Barack Obama. All the people that President Obama had put in power, maybe they don't agree. Maybe they are have a different view of politics that should be used by the country. Now, the argument of deep state is there's a lot of people who work in government who maybe aren't of the same viewpoint as the current president. So should they be there? So, for instance, if you get a job with the Environmental Protection Agency as a scientist, right, that is supposed to be based on this idea that you are there to do a job. Maybe your job is, wetland analysis. You go and you analyze, wetlands to see if territory has been lost, that kind of a thing, a more scientific thing. But there are some inherent political views about that. We see a lot of different ideas of, what should be protected legally when it comes to environmental issues and whatnot. So should that be affected by the politics, right? Should governing be affected by the politics? And Deep State says there are these people in the government who are so entrenched in a sense that it can carry over and basically counteract the change at the top of the government. It's kind of a controversial thing. We have forces that unify a state's power, centripetal forces, things that bring a state together. The idea of external aggressions. In 2001, when the Twin Towers of New York were destroyed in a terrorist attack by Al Qaeda, President George Bush was not very popular before that. But after that, his approval rating was 85%. When somebody attacks a country, one of the things that happens is people kind of rally together and help each other out. If there's this feeling of being, attacked, people kind of take this us versus them attitude, and that can unite a country. Federal structures. We are 50 different states, like Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, but we have laws that unify us and a federal structure that brings us all together. So, for instance, you may have different kinds of traffic laws in Wisconsin and Illinois, but the idea of marriage, that anywhere you are married in the United States, the federal law says that is a marriage that is valid everywhere, right? So this has some overarching things. National mass media and education. We are all roughly in this country given roughly the same amount of education. It may be different state by state, but it's the same pattern of kindergarten, grade school, high school, and college. Or in some countries, a shared culture and language. So in Germany, right, most people who are there also are culturally German, and that helps keep a state together. But there are things that can push a state apart, so they can break it apart. So what are the things that would drive a state apart? Centrifugal forces bring people together. What are the things that would pull them apart? Well, political and inequality or economic inequality is a great start, right? If certain people have power and certain people don't, right, that can be a huge driver. If you have a large number of people who do not have access to power or money and are oppressed, eventually, if you oppress them too much and there's too many of them, they will rise up. That's often what happens in a revolution, right? That the people at the bottom who have the less economic actions finally get tired of it. So if you have a country that has a high degree of this, so if you have a country where you have a very small amount of people who have control and money and a large population who is basically disenfranchised and doesn't have that, well, eventually if you get to that point where there's more of them, that overcomes any benefit. That can drive people apart. So within that, you also have separatist movements. If you have a country that has more than one nation, so Spain is a great example. We think of Spain, this country, as everyone being Spanish. And Spain is the political organization, and their citizenship is Spanish. But within Spain, you have people that identify as Spanish, but you also have people who identify as Castilian or Basque or other groups. And people who are Castilian or Basque live within Spain, but their culture is slightly different. There's actually a separate Castilian language called Catalan, and the people who are Basque, their language is not related to any language in Europe. So they have a slightly different culture. And at times, they are more willing to be part of Spain when they feel that their political and economic inequality is less. But if it rises, there's separatist movements. And so a few years back in Barcelona, which is the capital of the area that is Catalan in Spain, they felt that the central government in Madrid was taking too much power and that they weren't enjoying that power or sharing it. That led to a rise, a separatist movement. In the United Kingdom, Scotland is a separate cultural group, separate country, if you will, in a sense. And in the last few years, there's been talks of them leaving, having a vote to leave, which has been narrowly defeated, but it's still there. So a state has to have territorial integrity. And what it means is within its own territory, it has to be able to control it. It has to have a legitimate force. So what's to stop me from saying that this area of the house is the Republic of Jasonland? Well, because I don't have the ability to have my own tanks and guns. The state has that. The state has control, right? So Chicago, what would happen in Chicago if the police were driven out of a neighborhood? Right? What would happen if the local gangs in the city of Chicago were able to get enough guns and firepower to actually drive the police away? Well, then is that really part of Chicago? And you might say no, because they're not exercising control. This happens in many areas. It's called a civil war, right? So think about the United States. In 1860, there was one country, the United States. After President Lincoln was elected, the southern half of the country voted to leave. And they built an army and they exercised control and stopped allowing the United States government to do so. That was a civil war. In Iraq, right? Iraq has many different cultures. There are Sunni Arabs, Shiite Arabs, and there are Kurds in the north. And after we invaded and toppled the central government of Saddam Hussein, there was no strong government to exercise legitimate force. And at one point, basically these three areas were basically acting or operating as three separate countries. And there's a lot of talk that if things get really tense in the Middle East, if cooperation breaks down, you might see Iraq break into three countries. Another example is Brexit. So the United Kingdom was part of the European Union. They shared a common currency, they shared similar laws, but the people of the United Kingdom decided they didn't want to do this anymore. So they had a vote to withdraw. And so the European Union is no longer the law of the United Kingdom. It's left that part. So the European Union has lost some of its integrity. If you have an area that you control, then you have to have a boundary to mark that edge of control, right? So this is the boundary of North Korea and South Korea, and this marks right here the edge or the extent of North Korean control. That marks the territory they own. Now, borders can be natural or artificial. If your border follows a river or a seacoast, that river or seacoast was there before, you're just following that. Sometimes boundaries follow the highest points of mountains, ridges like that, or hills, or lakes. So there's natural. But some are artificial. This line right here in the Korean Peninsula is completely artificial. This is actually where the Korean War ended in 1953. This is where the South Korean and American troops were, and this was the North Korean and the Chinese troops. And when they finally stopped fighting, they just drew a line between the two armies. Sometimes you'll see a map of the United States, and some states have a straight line for a boundary. And that's completely artificial, right? We draw that. It's also what they call a stage for performance, right? At the United States, you know you're entering the United States because you have to go through customs, you have to go through the border checkpoint. If you've ever come into this country, you have to stop, you have to show papers, you have to talk to officials, they check what you're bringing in, right? Or you have a big welcome to so and so sign. So borders are kind of where you define that, okay? And they tell a little bit about the country's history. For instance, the borders between the United States and Canada, it's still relatively easy to cross. You have to still have papers and do all this, but it's much easier than the boundary between Mexico and the United States for the most part to cross. And that speaks to our history. We've had a much closer relationship with Canada than Mexico, or I should say, a much friendlier relationship, right? And in some parts of the world, you can't even cross a boundary at all. The boundary between India and Pakistan is almost impossible to cross, and they have basically been fighting wars since the 1940s. So boundaries also define and contain a country. Now some borders are more porous. You can have hard or soft borders. The border between the United States and Canada up until recently was very porous. You could pretty much go back and forth. In certain parts of Mexico and the United States, it's very porous. There are a lot of people who live in San Diego and go to Tijuana, or live in Tijuana and work in San Diego, back and forth. But some borders are very hard. The border between North and South Korea is probably the hardest border in the world. It's 3 miles wide because within that 3 miles you have fortifications and barbed wire and minefields and remote controlled guns and God knows what else. You do not go from South Korea to North Korea at all. There's only one point and very, very difficult. It's a very hard border. Okay? So that's also a non porous border. Things don't go through, not only people, but trade, communication, ideas, these also are cut off. Borders are often a source of conflict because borders are the edges of territories. So it's where territorial sovereignty kind of meets another country. And if there's a dispute, that's where it happens. So let's talk about the South China Sea. This is a big area of the ocean, right? But who owns this area of the ocean? So there's these boundaries, maritime boundaries. And there's many different ways of drawing these lines. But the one thing you notice here, there's a lot of overlap, isn't there? So this right here marks what China says is their water. So anything within this area is Chinese territory. But look at what Vietnam says. Vietnam says, well, this is ours right here. So they're saying this, but so this area right here, Vietnam says it's theirs. China says it's theirs. The Philippines says this is theirs. Brunei says this. All this confusion. Why? What is the big deal? Well, in this case, the main thing is resources. As our technology has gotten better and we're able to drill for oil in deeper parts of the ocean, it's been thought there's a lot of oil here on the seafloor. So it's very valuable territory. So each country is using whatever reason it can to explain why their boundaries should be here. So, for instance, in Chinese law, these tiny little islands right here, called the Parcel Islands and the Spratly Islands, are basically tiny, shallow islands that are only above water at low tide. So the Chinese government has gone in and put landfill on them and built big, huge islands, which they put on top of a big Navy base and an air base. And so that's how they use that to claim this is their land, right? Now, think about this. China has a lot more power in a lot of ways than Vietnam. And so even though Vietnam makes this claim, they really can't do much about it. But we also have this idea of the EEZ, these claims, right? So how far off the coast is the boundary of a country? In other words, how far off the west coast do we own the water? And it used to be, most countries agreed, that the first 3 miles off the coast of a country was their own water and land. But as we've developed the ability to take resources from the sea for drilling, for mining, for fishing, most countries now have what's called an EEZ, an exclusive economic zone, 200 miles off the coast. And what that says is they may not own the water, so you could sail through here, you could put a boat in here, but anything of value in here, that country gets first claim. But sometimes they overlap, like they do here in the South China Sea. And when you have that issue, you have conflict. Oftentimes, though, you do have cooperation. Some countries sign treaties, and you can see right here that Malaysia and Vietnam negotiated this line right here, right? But here they didn't. Okay? But boundaries also cause for a new perspective because the boundaries are basically a social construction, right? These lines don't exist in nature. We draw these lines on maps, and we draw these lines to define an area as part of a country, an identity. Remember we talked about Africa, and one of the issues with Africa is a lot of the countries that were former colonies, the boundaries did not represent the ethnic groups on the ground. But over time, you started to see that more and more people will identify with being maybe Sudanese than being of their tribal group. And so that idea of the changing of allegiance to your country and the social construct, borders provide that. I'm going to pause right here and we're going to come back with the last part, the geography of elections.